Have you been wondering what exactly a podcast is, or how to create one, or how to market your podcast and make money from it? Then you don't have to worry or imagine again, because in this episode of the Billionaire Journey podcast, we're going to talk about how to create a podcast and make money from it. Hello there, my name is Shola Matthew, and this is the Billionaire Journey podcast. I want to appreciate every one of you who have been listening to this podcast, since the day that it was launched. And today is the 10th episode. And for the last 10 days, guys, we've been publishing this podcast back to back. And I'm so excited that you joined me on this journey to becoming and remaining a billionaire, right? And yeah, today we're gonna, it's just like a gift that I want to give to you. And at the end of this episode, right, I'm gonna share this episode in our newsletter. So if you have not subscribed to our newsletter, please go to thebillionairejourney.com and subscribe to our newsletter. Okay? And I'm so excited because of this episode. This really means a lot to me and to the entire team members of the Billionaire Journey, and I'm so super excited. Thank you everyone for being part of this. So let's get started. Wherever you are listening to this podcast from, I want to tell you that you can start your own podcast today and monetize it eventually. And I want you to kind of take action, because action is very important. It's even one of the things that we spoke about in our previous episode. God rewards action takers. You can go listen to that episode, right? So it is not just about listening to this podcast. It is about taking action. And at the end of this episode, and after you've created your podcast, please do well to tag us on social media. You can tag me as Shola Matthew, or hashtag the Billionaire Journey podcast, and tell us what your podcast is about, and we could share your podcast to other audience. And who knows, maybe after listening to your podcast and I love it, I could share it with our audience here at the Billionaire Journey podcast. So let's get started. First, I want to assume that maybe some people are listening and don't know what exactly is podcast. Of course, you are listening to a podcast right now, and it doesn't mean that you actually know what exactly a podcast is. But if you are listening to this podcast, you're listening to this audio, maybe you've downloaded it or somebody shared it to you, you are actually listening to a podcast. So what exactly is a podcast? To simply put it, a podcast is any digital audio file in episodes which you can download from the internet. It's that simple. It's just like a radio on demand. It's just that radio, you have to tune into a radio and listen live. But a podcast, you can always go to the internet. You can either listen to the podcast from there, or you download it to your own device and you start listening to it. So that is basically what a podcast is. And this could be arranged in a series or groups, to make it easier for listeners to be able to download. For example, you're checking this podcast, you see that we have episode 1, episode 2, and this episode you're listening to is actually the 10th episode of the Billionaire Journey podcast. So there are different podcasts, examples of podcasts, that I've listened to. One of my favorite podcasts is The Remarkable People by Robert. What's the name of this guy? Kawasaki. Is actually, he's the chief marketing officer for Canva, but the name of the podcast is The Remarkable People, right? So you want to go check that podcast out. And I also listened to Marketing School by Neil Patel and his partner. And one of my podcasts again that I love listening to is On Becoming, right? And On Purpose, yeah. And there's another podcast. We have a lot of podcasts. I don't want to bore you out with the different podcasts that I listen to, but these are just series of podcasts that you could actually listen to as well. And there are different ways by which podcasts are structured, right? For example, what you're listening to me, right, is just like a solo podcast, right? Where I am the only one speaking, right? And you're listening to my voice right now. But there are also some podcasts that has to do with group podcasts, more like a discussion where two or more people sit down to discuss a particular topic, right? So those are the different types of podcasts that we have. And it could be more another podcast whereby you bring a guest, and then that guest, you interview the guest, just like an interview podcast, and so on and so forth. So those are the different types of podcasts that we have. So what are the things that you need to start your own podcast? Before I go into that, so many people confuse what a podcast is to a blog, right? So there's a tiny difference between a podcast and a blog. So a podcast is an audio, is an audio format that you listen to, while a blog is what you read. You have to read a book. But sometimes people can combine the two together. You can have a podcast in a blog. When people who are not able to listen to a podcast, will be able to read the blog post about that podcast. So basically the two can work hand in hand, but there's just a difference between a podcast and a blog. And one of the importance of podcasts is that you can be working and trust that you might be doing something else right now as you're listening to this podcast. Am I correct? Oh, great. Excuse me. So people, when they are driving in their car, or when they are doing another work, they can keep listening to the podcast. And because with podcast you can actually multitask, so you can be listening to a podcast and you can be doing something else. So that's one of the reasons why podcast is such an interest for a whole lot of people. And in the United States, millions of people download and listen to podcasts. So the podcast is a market that is growing exponentially. Every single day people always listen to podcasts, and I believe that it's a market that is yet untapped. So what are the things that you need to start a podcast? The first thing that you need to start a podcast is, guess what? It's your voice. Yes, I know a lot of people are like, oh, maybe I need money, maybe I need a big microphone, maybe I need a big device, maybe I need a strong phone, maybe I need this and that. No, it's your voice. And I learned this first from a guy called Dio Samuel. In fact, he's the first person that I got to learn more about podcasting from, and I really respect him a lot. He owns the Audacity to Lead podcast, and you can go search for that later on. It's called Audacity to Lead podcast. I respect him a lot, and I've learned a lot from him. So, it's your voice. That's the first thing you need. It's amazing that a lot of people don't know that their voice is an instrument for creating lasting change. Yeah, your voice is an instrument for creating lasting change. So the first thing that you need, my friend, to start a podcast is your voice. And I believe you have that voice. See, and so many people were like, but I don't have the radio voice. I don't know. Your voice is unique, and a lot of people want to listen to your voice. Of course, I know that there are some people when they speak, Queen's English or deep voice and all of that, but it's good. But every one of us has a voice, and your voice is an instrument for creating change. This number two thing that you need to start a podcast is your idea, right? And when selecting your idea, I always like to talk to people about this. Some people like, should I follow my passion or should I follow the money? I want to tell you, follow the two. There's nothing wrong in following the two. It's just like, I remember we were talking about, running a podcast, everybody, and somebody said that quality over quantity. And I asked the person, is it possible to have both quantity and quality? And the person said, it's rare. And I said, I love rare. I love rare. So to select your idea, you can follow both passion and the money. And this is how the thing works. Picture a 3-circle that is interlocked, right? Picture 2 cycles now. Let's talk about 2 cycles that is interlocked. The first cycle has your passion. The second cycle has money, right? So the center of that, right, is now where your idea is. Basically, what I'm trying to say is this: even if you're starting something towards a passion, make sure that there is a market for it, right? For example, let's say that you have an idea on gender equality, okay, and you start podcasting about it. There is market for that. It's just that a lot of people might not know, right? By the time we get to monetizing your podcast, I'm going to talk more about that, right? So, where was I? Yeah. So, gender equality, and you can monetize that podcast eventually, and we're going to get to monetizing your podcast. So the first thing you need is your voice. The second thing you need to start a podcast is an idea. And the third thing you need is a recording device. So it's just like your earphone. Your phone, right, is the recording device. And I believe that if you are listening to this podcast right now, right, you have a smartphone, you have a device that can record, So, and the other stuff, that you need, like, maybe a website, but it's not compulsory, because I'm going to share with you a tool that is going to help you, to start a podcast immediately. So, number 1, you need your voice. Number 2, you need an idea. Number 3, you need a recording device. And number 4, you need an earpiece, right? So it's not compulsory, but if you have an earpiece, it's very good. An earpiece with a microphone can replace you getting a microphone. At least you can start with that. And I always tell people it's not about perfection when you're starting out, right? It's about just going, taking action, rapid, massive action. Along the line, you're going to find that exact, ideal perfection that you are seeking for, because sometimes the enemy of good is perfection, or perfection is the enemy of good. So the last but not the least is your podcast hosting platform. So not to complicate things, right? I want to share with you an app that I use, and that is what I'm currently using to record this podcast. It's called Anchor. Anchor is spelled as ANCHOR, I believe. yeah. So it's called Anchor FM, right? So if you search for Anchor FM, I believe you're gonna see, the app that I'm talking about, ANCHOR. That is the name of the app. It's called Anchor, and you can download it on your iOS, or you can download it on Android. Okay, so after recording your podcast, you can use that app to record your podcast. You can use the app to add background music, like the background music you're listening to right now, even though I've not added it, but I know you will be listening to it eventually. Okay, it's added through the app. So the app is what you need to get started, really, sincerely. And the reason I'm sharing this app is because even if you're going anywhere and you don't have a laptop, or you have a laptop, you don't take your laptop with you, you can just step into somewhere very close, and record your podcast. It's as simple as that, right? So those are the 5 major things that you need in order to start a podcast. What are the 5 things again? Number 1, I said what? Your voice. Number 2, your idea. Number 3, a recording device. Number 4, which is optional, is an earpiece. And number 5 is the app called Anchor. Right, so those are the things that you need in order to start a podcast. So, let's say you have decided that, my podcast is going to be just solo podcast or interview. Make sure that you select one that you can be consistent with, right? For example, my podcast, I'm talking about something every single day. Right, so that's why I chose the Billionaire Journey podcast. Is a broad topic to some extent that I can share anything, right, related to being a billionaire. And this is actually one of the things that I can share with you. And I believe that you're learning something from it, aren't you? Okay, I want to believe you're learning something today. So now, that is how to create a podcast. So, those are the things that you need to create a podcast. So, how do you create this podcast? Now, when you get this Anchor app, right, you sign in, you create an account with your email, and then you sign in, and then there's a place where you can create your podcast. The first thing you need to create is your trailer. So, is it called trailer? Yeah, it's just like short thing about what your podcast is about, and then you share it with the world. And then when you share that podcast, Anchor is going to help you to distribute it on different platforms. Okay, so and sometimes you might need to distribute it to other platforms by yourself. So by distributing on like Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, you just copy. There's something we call the RSS feed, right? You just copy that feed and put it in all the platforms like Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and all of that, and then you're good to go. But don't let that stop you, because like I told you, I just want to ensure that everything is simplified. So the first way to go about it is get an Anchor app, create your podcast, and share your first episode with your friends, right? So now, how do you market your podcast? So yesterday I was listening to a podcast by this. Yeah, that's this name of the guy is Gary Kawasaki. Gary Kawasaki is the host of the Remarkable People podcast. So I was listening to a podcast where he invited Seth Godin. I believe that's the name. And this guy is one of the kings of marketing. So he said that if you are starting to market something, can you get at least 5 people that can listen or that can test your product, or buy it and say, yes, this product is amazing, we want to share with other people? Can you get at least 5 people? And I want to ask you the same question. Can you get at least 5 people that can listen to your podcast and say, yeah, I love this podcast, let me share with other people? I bet you can. Right? So it's not about reaching out to large numbers of people initially. It is basically about distribution, or networking, right? So when you create that networking effect, you just get 5 people, and 5 people probably share to at least one person, making 10 people, then 10 people share, just keep increasing that way. That is the first way to start. Share your ideas with people. Get the link to your first podcast episode, share it with people, let them keep sharing, right? So that's the first step. Number 2 step on how you can market your podcast is, if you have guests, invite guests that are a bit popular. Now, I'm not taking guests for now on my podcast because I want to reach a particular milestone before I start taking in guests. But if you take in guests, right, that are very popular, that does not mean that if I see Barack Obama tomorrow and he says he wants to appear on my podcast, I won't let him. I will. Okay. But what I mean is this: when you invite a guest that is popular, right, And then after the interview and all this stuff, you give the guest your link, and then the guest can share the podcast. It's not compulsory, but he or she can share your podcast to his or her audience, and then from there, you have a lot of people coming to listen, to your podcast. Number 3 way by which you can, market your podcast is to run ads. It could be Facebook ads, it could be Google ads, it could be Twitter ads, just run ads. If you don't know how to run ads, you can learn it on YouTube, or maybe visit my YouTube channel, Shola Mati. You're going to see a lot of tutorials on how you can run ads on different platforms. Okay, that's number 3, right? Number 4, if you want, you can just create a small flyer about your podcast and the link to where that podcast is, and put it on your status, put it on your DP. For example, if you go to my WhatsApp, I know not a lot of people, not everybody listening is on my WhatsApp because it's more like a personal place for me, but on my WhatsApp right now, I have my podcast album art, right? I created that with Canva, and it's actually what I have as my profile picture, right? So these are simple ways by which you can market your podcast. The last way, which is the 5th way, is you can create a flyer and probably hang it around your house, or if you have an office, just put it somewhere around your office, say listen to my podcast, or put somewhere something catch like begin your journey to a billionaire by listening to this podcast, right? Just like my podcast. And then people will begin to listen to your podcast. So those are the 5 ways that I believe you can use to promote your podcast, right? And I want to give you a bonus tip, though this is an advanced tip, but I still want to share it because I believe that there are some people who are advanced and are still listening to this podcast. So if you are in that category, this is an opportunity for you. Another thing for you to do is to, if you have a website, right, is to create a landing page where you start collecting people's names and emails. It's very, very important. Start collecting real fans of your podcast, and this is something that you should start doing from day one. When I created my first episode, second episode, I went ahead immediately. Although I don't know if it was the first episode, I bought the domain name for the podcast already, thebillionairejourney.com. And I think it was the 3rd episode or thereabout that I announced that we now have a website and you can now subscribe to our podcast. And right now, if you go to thebillionairejourney.com, you'll see what I'm talking about, right? You'll be able to put your name and email. And, for example, this special podcast episode, we can share with you through email, or when we have amazing information, we share with our audience, and that way you can have repeat listeners to your podcast. So it's important for you to build that list. Very, very important. Yeah. Now, let's get to the juicy part of the podcasting, right? Of podcasting. And what is that? It's how to make money from your podcast. I know a lot of you are waiting for this. I'm going to tell you. So number 1 way to make money from your podcast is by running ads on your podcast. So let's say that your podcast is about beauty, right? Things that has to do with women becoming beautiful, or men becoming more beautiful or handsome, and one of the people that could run ads on your podcast could be a makeup actress or something like that, or it could be people who sell beauty products, right? So you get those people, and then maybe at the beginning of your podcast or in the middle of your podcast, when people have started listening to your podcast, then you talk about that particular product. Say, oh, let's pause for a short break. Just like a radio program, So you pause for a short break, then you talk about that product, and then you continue. And by this advertisement, I mean that these people or the product or the brand will have paid you for you to do this. But usually, you have to grow your podcast to a particular downloads or to a particular stage before you can start getting this kind of advertisement. Okay, so it's very important because that's one of the major ways by which podcasters actually make money. Advertisement. Number 2, you can collect donations. For example, if you love this podcast, why not donate to us, right? And if you are interested, you can send me an email at podcast@thebillionairejourney.com that you want to donate, and I'm going to send you, our payment details by which you can donate. But one of the ways you actually do this is, let's say you have a PayPal or you have a Stripe account, you can put the link somewhere on your website or in the podcast description and say, if you love this podcast and you want us to continue, kindly donate to this podcast. And people can donate to your podcast. I remember at a time, and this is one of the importance of having a podcast, is create impact, right? I remember at the time, it was 2017. I was still in Nigeria. I was 7, and there was this young boy called Nee. So the guy had, I think, called lymphatic cancer, and at the time I was running a podcast called the Charity Connect podcast. If you go to Charity Connect podcast right now, you're still going to see that website. It's still up, Charity Connect podcast. So I went to the state. I went to my former school. It was still an undergraduate, and I interviewed different people about that particular guy, because we were trying to raise money for him, and it was in millions of naira. And then I interviewed people, different students, talk about the good things about this guy, and I published the podcast and I distributed it across different networks. To my amazement, we're able to raise a lot of money. Like, I can't remember, I think it was up to 300,000 or thereabout that I sent. That someone donated it. One of my friends from India, listened to the podcast and was like, wow, please send me your Bitcoin address. And he sent Bitcoin to me, and I cashed out the Bitcoin and I sent the money to the account that was that was allocated to raising the money for that particular guy. And you know what? He came out successful with the operation, I think he was going through chemotography or something like that. Is that what they call it? Apologies, guys. Anyway, so you can collect donations, right? And that donation could be to help other people or to continue running your podcast. But basically, I'm talking about how to make money from your podcast. Number 1, I said advertisement. Number 2, donation. Number 3, you can offer subscription on your podcast. And this is something spectacular that, Anchor gives you the ability to do selflessly. Just today, I realized that I could actually collect subscription on my podcast, and I added the subscription. So there are some episodes on the Billionaire Journey podcast that will not be available for everybody, to the public. It's going to be available to our subscribers only. And with as little as 0.99 pounds, right, you can subscribe to our podcast monthly. You just have to pay 0.99 pounds monthly per month for you to listen to all the episodes that will be releasing to our subscribers only. For example, like this episode could be something that I will be sharing to subscribers only, detailing, things on how you can journey from being a zeronaire to being a billionaire, right? So, subscribers subscription is another way by which you can make money from your podcast. So another way by which you can make money from your podcast is by selling products. Now, this could be your own product or other people's product, but let me start with just your product. So I will talk about the other one as the last part of making money from your podcast. It could be your own product. So let's say you have a digital product or even a physical product anyway, and let's say you have a book or a course. You can direct people to that website. For example, I have a course called the WhatsApp Income Generator. If you go to sholamatthew.com SOLAMATHEW.com/WIG. SholaMatthew.com/wig, right? You're going to find that book there. That's just one of the, I'm just showing you how to do that, right? If you go to that place, for example, you can just go and buy my book, and then this book is going to help you to make money with your WhatsApp. So that's one of the ways by which you can make money from podcasting, right? And the last but not the least is affiliate marketing. So this is about selling other people's product. Let's say, you know a brand that has an incredible product and you want to sell that product. It could be on health, but usually it should be something related to what your audience will be looking for, right? And this product is going to help people, right? Recommend it to them, and then you put your link or give them your link, and then these people can go ahead and buy this product. And that is why I said you should start collecting, building your list, collecting the emails of people, because it's easier when people have been listening to your podcast and then you've been sending them awesome and useful emails. And then when you have this amazing product that you believe is going to help them, you can share with them through email. All right. I hope you have learned something today. Making sure that this podcast is not too long, so that you can learn one or two things from it. And I believe and I hope that you learned something, you got value from this podcast. If you have any question, feel free to send me a tweet on Twitter at Shola Matthew, or on Instagram at the Shola Matthew, or on Facebook at Coach Shola Matthew. And if you want to follow me on YouTube, you can go to Shola Matthew. You find me on YouTube. And please do well to subscribe to this podcast, right, in whatever platform you're listening to it from. And make sure you go to thebillionairejourney.com and subscribe. We're going to be sending you some amazing stuff through email that we don't share in the public. And if you want to subscribe to our podcast, join the Billionaires Club of the Billionaire Journey podcast by subscribing monthly, with 0.99 pounds, right? And we'll look forward to going on this journey with you. Lastly, please ensure that you go to social media platform. Just tag me if you learned something from this and you have created your podcast, right? Tag me on social media platforms and use the hashtag the Billionaire Journey podcast. And I look forward to hearing from you. I look forward to you, starting your podcast. And who knows, maybe by the time I start accepting guests, you might be one of my first guests to be on this podcast. Thank you very much for listening to the Billionaire Journey podcast today. I look forward to seeing you some other time. Bye.